Blood in the Fog. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The bus wheezed to a halt, its brakes screaming like a dying animal. Clara's stomach churned as she stepped off, the thick fog wrapping around her like a cold, damp blanket. The driver gave her a fleeting look of pity before shutting the door and driving off, leaving her stranded in the eerie silence of Ashwick. She had come to this remote town to visit her Aunt Margaret, an eccentric woman who'd been estranged from the family for years. Margaret had sent Clara a handwritten letter weeks ago, insisting she visit. "There's something you need to know," the letter read. Margaret's shaky handwriting and the ominous tone had been enough to lure Clara away from her bustling city life. The air smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic. The fog was so dense that Clara could barely see a few feet ahead. As she made her way up the cobblestone path toward her aunt's house, an unsettling quiet enveloped her. No birds, no rustling leaves, just her own hurried footsteps and the distant drip of water. Margaret's house stood at the edge of the woods, a crumbling Victorian mansion with ivy crawling up its walls. Clara hesitated at the gate, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. She shook it off and pushed the gate open, the rusty hinges squealing in protest. The front door opened before she could knock. Margaret stood there, her frail frame hunched, and her eyes darting nervously. "You came," she whispered, her voice trembling. She grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her inside, slamming the door shut behind them. "Aunt Margaret, are you okay?" Clara asked, concerned. Margaret's grip was surprisingly strong for someone so fragile. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "But now that you're here, you need to listen to me. The fog, it's not what it seems." Chapter 2. The Warnings. Margaret's house was a chaotic mess of papers, books, and strange artifacts. Clara's eyes wandered to a series of black and white photographs pinned to a corkboard. Each photo showed the town of Ashwick, but something was off. In every picture, the fog seemed to have a life of its own, forming shapes that resembled faces, hands, and even entire bodies. Margaret followed Clara's gaze. "It's the fog," she said. "It's alive. It's hunting us." Clara frowned. "Hunting? Margaret, that's not possible." Margaret's hands trembled as she grabbed a notebook from the cluttered table. She flipped through its pages, revealing sketches of grotesque faces emerging from the fog. "I've seen it take people," she said. "It's silent, and it's relentless. It's been here for centuries, feeding." Clara tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but there was something about Margaret's tone that unsettled her. She decided to humor her aunt. "Why haven't you left, then?" Margaret's face darkened. "You can't leave Ashwick, not once the fog knows you." Chapter 3. The First Night. Clara woke to the sound of whispers. At first she thought it was a dream, but the voices grew louder, a cacophony of overlapping murmurs. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The room was pitch dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The whispers were coming from outside. She crept to the window and peered out, her breath fogging the glass. The fog was thicker than before, swirling like a living thing. For a moment she thought she saw a face staring back at her, pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. She stumbled back, her pulse racing. "Clara," a voice hissed from the fog. It was faint but unmistakable. Her name. She slammed the curtains shut and pressed her back against the wall, trying to calm her breathing. "It's just your imagination," she whispered to herself. But deep down she knew it wasn't. Chapter 4. The Disappearance. The next morning Margaret was gone. Clara searched the house, calling her aunt's name, but there was no response. The front door was wide open, and muddy footprints led out into the fog. Clara hesitated at the threshold, her aunt's warnings echoing in her mind. She grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside. The fog was thicker than ever, swallowing the light and muffling all sound. Clara followed the footprints, her heart pounding with every step. The trail led her to the woods, where the trees loomed like skeletal hands. She found Margaret's scarf snagged on a branch, but no sign of her aunt. Instead, she heard the whispers again, faint and haunting. They seemed to come from all directions, growing louder with every passing second. Clara, the voices called, overlapping and distorted. Panic surged through her. She turned to run, but the fog seemed to close in, disorienting her. Shapes began to form in the mist, faces, hands, and twisted bodies reaching out for her. Chapter 5, The Town's Secret. Clara eventually stumbled back to the house, shaking and out of breath. She locked the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. Whatever was happening in Ashwick, it was real, and it was terrifying. Determined to find answers, she began searching through Margaret's notes and journals. One entry caught her eye. The fog is not natural. It is a curse, a punishment for the sins of our ancestors. They made a pact, and now we pay the price. The fog demands blood. It takes what it is owed. The journal detailed a dark history of Ashwick rituals, sacrifices, and a pact made with an ancient entity. The fog, it seemed, was the manifestation of that entity's hunger. Clara's hands trembled as she read the final line. If you hear the whispers, it already knows you. Chapter 6, A Desperate Plan. Clara knew she couldn't stay in Ashwick, but if Margaret's words were true, leaving wouldn't be easy. The fog wouldn't let her go. She spent the day preparing, gathering supplies, and mapping out the quickest route to the nearest town. As night fell, the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. This time they were accompanied by thudding footsteps outside the house. Clara peeked through the curtains and froze. Figures were emerging from the fog, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were human-shaped, but their faces were blank, like featureless masks. They surrounded the house, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "Leave me alone," Clara screamed, clutching a knife she'd found in the kitchen. The figures didn't respond. They simply stood there waiting. Chapter 7, Blood in the Fog. With no other options, Clara made a run for it. She burst out the back door and sprinted toward the woods, her flashlight cutting through the fog. The figures gave chase, their distorted whispers filling the air. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. But the fog was relentless, closing in around her. Suddenly, she tripped over something and fell to the ground. When she looked up, she saw Margaret. Her aunt was pale and lifeless, her eyes staring blankly at the sky. Blood pooled around her, soaking into the earth. The fog swirled around the body, almost as if it were feeding on her. Clara screamed, tears streaming down her face. The figures were closing in, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Desperation took over, and Clara grabbed a nearby branch, swinging it wildly. "Take me instead," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Leave her alone." The fog seemed to hesitate, the figures freezing in place. Then, as if in response, the whispers grew louder, more deafening. Clara felt the cold tendrils of the fog wrapping around her, pulling her down. Chapter 8, The Dawn. Clara awoke to sunlight filtering through the trees. The fog was gone, and the air was crisp and clear. She sat up, her body aching and her mind reeling. Margaret's body was gone, as were the figures. She stumbled back to the town, expecting to find it deserted. Instead, the streets were bustling with life. The townspeople greeted her warmly, as if nothing had happened, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Clara realized the truth. The fog had taken its due, and the town's facade of normalcy was part of the curse. She left Ashwick that day, vowing never to return. But no matter how far she went, she could still hear the whispers whenever the fog rolled in. The fog had marked her, and it was only a matter of time.